Wes and the Hunting Club. Daddy was a family man, but he was a man. Like many others in his day, he had a soft spot for hunting dogs and a genuine love for hunting. When he was not working at home or at church, he was most likely out hunting. Of course, any activity that was fun to do and also produced food was doubly attractive. After all, he had a wife and 7 kids to feed. This is an account of one hunting trip initiated by Daddy. What happened on this trip set the stage for an incident that still ranks in the top 10 of all time most requested stories at any family gathering. Because the facts central to this tale have aged some 50 years, it's all happened in about 1947. And because we want to protect the innocent from undue ridicule, we will brand this tale as fiction, although for the most part it is the absolute truth. Having disclaimed that much, the reader is invited to continue with the full assurance that everything stated beyond this point is more or less true. There we were, 5 pool boys all sort of milling around waiting on Daddy to get home. Leon and Jackie Warren, who lived just down the hill from us, were there also, but they were just waiting in general and not knowing why. It was time to eat supper, but we didn't eat until Daddy got home, so we waited. It didn't seem too fruitful to begin a game of anything that required any length of time or contact with dirt. We might have to quit in a hurry and race to the table should Daddy arrive suddenly. Having already kind of washed our hands in the used and reused pan of cold soapy water resting on the shelf on the back porch by the back door, no one was anxious to lose valuable table jockeying time by getting sent back out to re-wash. Mama would see to it that her standards for table hygiene were not compromised. There we were, each of us dealing with the surplus of time in different ways. Janice and Wilma were in the house giving Mama a hand with last-minute supper preparation. Jay was leaning against the side of the house. From this spot, he could easily see if Daddy were coming up the road. As soon as he could confirm Daddy's coming, he would begin his nearly imperceptible sidle toward the house. Wes and Wayne stood between Jay and the back door. They were inspecting something they held between them. I figured it was probably rocks or marbles or maybe even washers. Washers, as in nuts, bolts, and washers, were used in a tossing game with rules sort of like horseshoes. Whatever it was, it held their attention. This allowed Richard and I, being the 2 youngest and having the least understanding of the subtleties of the supper rush hour, to gain advantage even if we were not aware of it. Richard was demonstrating to me how he had learned from someone to make a hat out of a hanky. He was twisting the corners of this old handkerchief, and he tied little knots at each corner. He then poked his fist inside the umbrella-shaped handkerchief and stretched it into a nice round shape. Next, he put it on his head, pulling on the knots to adjust it to a proper fit. Suddenly, for some reason, the image of a 5-pound bag of cornmeal came to mind. The image left when Richard began to modify his design by adding a string to each corner. He bundled the other end of the 4 strings and tied them to a rock. The hat became a toy parachute. Leon and Jackie were eager to find some way of passing the time, and did so by playing with an unusual stick Jackie had found. Leon, the oldest, was explaining to Jackie the significance of the stick. He was certain the stick was of great value, as he identified the separate and distinct droppings of several different birds that must have spent the night on this particular stick back when it was a part of a tree limb. Jackie had to accept Leon's appraisal, since he had no experience himself to offer in opposition. Bluebird, redbird, blackbird, the poop all looked the same to Jackie even as Leon laboriously pointed out the imagined attributes of each. With all this industry in motion, the time finally arrived. Jay could hear the old Ford before he could see it. As recognition set in, he slowly and deliberately began his move. First, he uncrossed his legs, and very casually he stood upright, no longer dependent on the old house for support. Then he uncrossed his arms and eased his hands in his pockets. Only then did he turn toward the back door. Too much too soon. All other activities stopped as everyone saw Jay begin the classic, "I'm invisible and you can't see me" move. Everybody, including Leon and Jackie, although they didn't know why, were drawn into Jay's wake. The scene began slowly at first, each participant gauging the movements of the initiator and being concerned that quite possibly it was just one of Jay's tricky false starts. Then in earnest, the action sped up as the sight and sound of Daddy's truck moved quickly from imagination to reality. The race for the back door was officially on. Wes and Wayne scrambled to put away whatever had earlier held their interest, but now did not. Wayne was having more difficulty negotiating the transition, since the pants that housed him were always much bigger than their occupant. As he hurried to stuff unknown treasures in his pockets, those same pockets worked against him by sliding further and further down his bottom until he could no longer run and stuff at the same time. He had to decide, stop and take time to load his pockets properly? Drop his treasures and hope to pick them up later? If he stopped, he'd be last to the table. If he dropped his treasures, they'd soon become the property of Leon and Jackie. If he continued onward with this increasing level of indecision, complicated by the equally troublesome decreasing level of his pants, Wayne was certain to be rejected at the door by Mama. Mama might not require a tie at supper, or even a shirt, but she did subscribe to the no pants, no service rule. Richard immediately lost interest in the combination hat parachute he'd invented. "Want this?" Richard asked as he handed me the string-laden rag and rock. This gift maneuvering was diversion enough for him to bolt for the back door ahead of me. His position further improved as he passed the still stumbling Wayne easily and was then able to close the gap on Wes. Hesitating after having just become the proud owner of the hat chute prototype, I literally got left in the dust. The finish order was set. Jay came in first, Wes got second, nearly tied by Richard at third. Wayne hopped to a disappointing fourth place. I came in last, but I didn't mind much because I got to be carried in. After he parked the old Ford, Daddy joined the race himself, scooping me up along the way. Mama collared Leon and Jackie at the door. Disqualified from further competition, they reluctantly made their way home. As they walked away, Jackie mumbled something to Leon about the bird roost stick that Jackie'd found, and that Leon now carried with an attitude that demonstrated his claim of sole ownership. Leon had used the time-honored 3 strikes rule to support the claim. He was older, bigger, and maintained possession of the stick in question. He had all 3 strikes covered. "Now let's eat," said Daddy after having finished the somewhat ritualistic blessing. The finish of the blessing might vary according to family situation or news of the day, but the beginning was always the same. After all of us were assembled around the table, each of us in our place, the Daddy would bow his head, pausing just long enough for everybody else to do likewise. Then he would start always with the same words. "Our Father in heaven, we thank you for these and all the other blessings." He would speak the words so fast that I was a much older lad before I realized he was not thanking God for the fleas and all the other blessings. The finish came and the Amen was said, and with 2 tugs on his nose, Daddy would say, "Let's eat," or something just as pithy, and then it begins. Like a studied dance troupe, veterans of many a performance, the Poole family pot-passing pageant would commence in all quarters of the table. Each member of the troupe reached and passed and dipped and forked and went about the singular task of designing their very own special plate of plenty. With portions parceled and pieces paired, next came the symphony of metal utensils. Spoons and forks striking plates and lips slurping up fresh sweetened iced tea and the unavoidable exhale of air. Then comes the unmistakable sound that follows only when a thirsty child swallows a favorite drink and punctuates his delight with a universally recognized rush of air. With everyone's attention completely focused upon the task of consuming a fair share of the table's bounty, suddenly and without any warning, the invitation was offered. "Any of you boys up for a little coon hunting tonight?" Daddy asked. Grunts of recognition were followed by a simultaneous loss of motor control in all of us boys, as 5 forks dropped to their plates in one loud clank. An unintelligible yet enthusiastic babble of voices confirmed the general positive mood of the group. It was settled then. The Poole men would go hunting this very night as soon as supper was done. This last requirement was settled quickly enough as each young Poole attended to the task of speed eating. With plates pushed back, stomachs patted, ahs uttered, and the cook properly thanked, it was time to get ready for the hunt. It was about this time in the revelry that Richard and I got the word that we were still a bit young to go on the hunt. Richard was probably old enough, but he didn't share the level of bloodlust already apparent in those just barely his senior. I was young enough that I didn't really understand the situation, except for being left out of something important. Richard knew that his staying behind would help make it easier for me to take. The preparation for the hunt is part of the experience. I have to say that because it's my only claim to being a part of it. Jay, Wes, and Wayne began the ritual of dressing for the hunt. It was chilly enough during the day, but as night fell it got even colder. Knowing he had to prepare for it, but not having the experience to know exactly how, Wayne was feverishly gathering and laying out on the bed all the clothing he had expected to wear for the event. By his own count, he had 3 sets of underwear, 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 2 pairs of socks, 1 long dish rag to substitute as a muffler, a snotty cap, a pair of old brown cotton gloves, and a Mackinaw coat that barely reached his bottom. Jay and Wes, not to be outdone by a younger brother, were making similar, though not as comprehensive, preparations of their own. When the 3 of them announced their readiness to Daddy, the hunt coordinator, he had to work hard to suppress an urge to comment, since to utter anything would likely induce an uncontrollable fit of laughter. "Okay, boys, go get Nell and Jack and meet me at the truck," Daddy said. "Will do," the 3 responded in unison. Nell was a beautiful female redbone, and Jack was a male black and tan. Both were purebred hounds. They were relatively large and mighty strong dogs. Both traits were demonstrated when Jay, Wes, and Wayne came to collect Nell and Jack from the dog pen. Knowing the beast as they did, the boys had already formed a plan. All they had to do was execute said plan. They would enter the pen, and while Wes and Wayne corralled the other dogs, Jay would put a leash on Jack and attach him temporarily to the gate post on the outside of the dog pen. Jay would then re-enter the dog pen and repeat the process with Nell. Once the dogs were secured outside the pen, Wes and Wayne would be free to exit the dog pen to the tune of 3 other dogs barking, crying, and howling from the disappointment and the indignity of being left behind while Nell and Jack were chosen for the hunt. Well, that's how the plan looked on paper. The 3 boys approached the dog pen, barely able to contain their excitement. That excitement was immediately transferred to the hounds. Jack was the most restless of the hounds, and recognizing first that a hunt was coming, he came to the gate to greet Jay. As Jay pulled the latch on the gate, Nell and the others came forward with a bound. As the combined weight of the 5 50-pound hounds landed upon the gate crashed open, causing the 3 boys, who, having had the misfortune to be lined up like dominoes, were compelled to fall down like them too. Off went the dogs on a dead run. With freedom comes choices, and having attained their freedom, the dogs didn't have a clear goal as far as where they should run. Jack was the leader, and wherever he ran, the dogs followed. The boys gave chase, but could only get as close as the dogs would allow, and they easily outmaneuvered the boys with dashes and darts and other 4-legged fancy footwork. Daddy came around the corner of the house to the backyard and stood amazed at the spectacle before him. He let out a sharp whistle that got the immediate attention of both boys and beasts. The boys turned to see Daddy standing there with the knuckles of his left hand resting on his hip, while with his right hand he gave a tug at his nose. One tug meant he was more amused than upset. "Come here, Jack," he said. Jack came over to Daddy and without complaint allowed him to attach the leash. Daddy led Jack back to the dog pen and the other dogs followed. Once inside the pen, Daddy sorted out the dogs, and after putting a leash on Nell, he brought Nell and Jack back outside the pen. "To the truck, boys, let's go hunting," said Daddy. Jay, being the elder brother, got to ride up front with Daddy. There wasn't enough room for everybody up there. Besides, someone needed to sit in the back with the dogs. It was a chilly ride to the woods for Wes and Wayne, but the heat from the 2 dogs, coupled with the excitement of the approaching hunt, made it easy enough to bear. Finally, after watching the road disappear into the darkness for nearly half an hour, the truck pulled off the gravel road and stopped. Jay jumped out and opened the gate to allow the truck to pass into an open field. Jay closed the gate and jumped back in the truck before Wes and Wayne realized what he was doing. Wayne took the opportunity to quickly ask the first, "Are we there yet?" Receiving no answer, he returned to his position of protection under dog number 1. Wes was busy making a blanket out of dog number 2. It was dark enough now that the only light was from the truck. The ride became increasingly bumpy, and the truck slowed to a crawl as Daddy steered the old Ford as near as possible to where the hunt would commence. Finally, he stopped the truck and announced, "We're here! Let the dogs out!" Oh my goodness. Daddy tied the dogs to the tailgate of the truck temporarily while he gathered the hunting equipment they would take into the woods. He had a shotgun that he would carry and a .22 rifle for Jay. There was an inference that Wes and Wayne might be allowed a shot with the .22 later, but they would not be carrying the rifle. Daddy also had a hunting hat that had a special fitting on the front for a carbide light. It made him look like a coal miner, but it did provide a very good light. The light came from a gas given off from a dry chemical called carbide. You put the chemical in a reservoir at the base of the apparatus and added just a touch of water. A gas was given off from the chemical reaction. The reservoir was then closed, allowing only a small amount of the gas to escape through a valve. The valve was set in the center of a shiny metal dish, and all you had to do was put a lighted match to the escaping gas and you got a flame. With some fine-tuning on the gas flow, you could produce a pretty good light. Daddy got his light adjusted the way he wanted, and then quickly went over the plan for the hunt with the brothers three listening for all they were worth. First off, the hunt would be a short one. Daddy would turn the dogs loose, then he would start into the woods with the brothers three close behind. The guns would be carried unloaded, since there would be plenty of time to load them on an as-needed basis later. If the dogs treed a coon, the evict and conquer method would be attempted before other means. This was a strategy by which the treed coon was scared out of his nest and onto the ground with 22 shots strategically placed near the nest. The theory was that if the dogs didn't capture the coon, then the stick men would be called into the fray. Wes and Wayne would be the stick men. If a grounded coon happened to get by the dogs, Wes and Wayne had to be ready to administer a good whack with a stick to subdue the creature, or at least detain him long enough for the dogs to catch up. Having gone over the plan and seeing varying amounts of understanding in the faces of the brothers three, Daddy reached for his dog horn, which in fact he had made for the horn of a bull. It was hollowed out all the way through, and it had a mouthpiece carved into the small end. He could get a really loud sound out of it that sounded like a chirp. Anyway, when he tested it with a short blast, he got the dogs' attention, not to mention the brothers three. Calling in the dogs was the real purpose of the horn, but it also served as an emergency alarm should people get separated in the woods. Daddy unleashed Nell and Jack, and with no more encouragement than, "Go get 'em!" they were off to find a raccoon. Daddy followed in the general direction of the dog's exit, and the brothers three followed him in the light he provided. The reader is cautioned at this point about trying to infer any sort of psychobabble parallels along the lines of the sons following in the light of the father. As the hunters made their way further and further into the woods, the light of Daddy's headlight seemed to be compressed by the ever-increasing darkness. Finally, the moment they'd all come for arrived. The dogs had treed something, and they proudly proclaimed as much to all within earshot. That included Daddy and the brothers three. Daddy picked up his pace, and at 6'6" that offered quite a challenge to the brothers three to keep up. They soon reached the target tree that was a huge old oak tree. It was all the bigger because it had grown from two separate trees that melded together to form one larger one. The dogs were barking and jumping up on the tree, biting at the bark as they jumped. Daddy tilted his head back, pointing his carbide headlight up the big oak, surveying the trunk of the old tree as he scanned upward. About 30 feet up, he spotted a fork in the tree, and right near that fork was a big hole. There had to be a coon inside that hole. "Okay, boys, let's get ready," Daddy said. The evict and conquer strategy was about to commence. Daddy slipped a shell into the breech of the shotgun. He instructed Jay to do the same with the .22 rifle. Wes and Wayne rummaged around frantically in the dark to find a good, stiff, manageable whacking stick. This was a difficult task, since most of the available light was being spent in the direction of the coon's lair. Finally, Wes and Wayne came up with opposing ends of the same stick. An argument over ownership ensued, and Daddy had to decide the issue quickly so as not to allow a minor dissension amongst the ranks to compromise the position. He broke the stick and gave half to each. Satisfied that everyone understood his assignment, Daddy signaled for execution of the plan to commence. Jay would rim shoot the entry hole, attempting to get the coon to go to ground. Wes and Wayne took a few practice swings as they stationed themselves near the base of the tree, just in case they were called into action. Daddy would maintain the lighting of the target, and if they needed, bring the shotgun into play only as a last resort. Jay raised the .22, aimed at the top edge of the hole, and squeezed off the first round. Spat came the sound from the rifle, and the bullet landed as intended with a glancing blow and sprayed a bit of bark into the entry hole. A shiny nose darted out past the edge of the opening and quickly returned to the darkness inside. Jay began to reload the single-shot rifle. At that point, the coon decided now was his chance to move. He bounded out of the hole and onto a limb. "He's getting away. I'm gonna have to shoot," said Daddy. This was fair warning to all the brothers three, and not so much from the danger aspect of a shotgun, as much as it was because they all knew how loud the old shotgun blast could be. Daddy pulled the trigger, and a boom was emitted so loud that it would continue ringing in the ears of the brothers three even after they'd returned home. Daddy's shot, whether intended or nor, landed behind the coon and served to cut the limb that supported him right off. He plummeted to the ground, bouncing off other limbs and almost getting hold of them as he sank to the floor of the woods. The landing was soft on the thick, leafy carpet, and away he went with the dogs in pursuit. Daddy told the brothers three to hold their ground and listen to the chase. The sounds went away from them only momentarily, then switched directions, then again, and then Daddy said, "Okay, Nell and Jack are bringing him back. Get ready with those sticks, boys. When he comes by here, you have to be ready to give him a good whack." The excitement was almost too much for the boys as they steeled themselves for what was to come. The commotion got closer and closer, till they could almost smell the freshly disturbed leaves on the ground as the coon and the dogs tore a path back to him. Suddenly, through an opening in the bushes, came the coon, followed immediately by Jack and Nell. The coon went right by Wayne, who had only enough time for a backswing, which he executed with such adrenaline-assisted force that he launched his half of the whacking stick backwards into the bushes behind him, rendering himself unarmed and effectively disqualified from further competition. Wes, on the other hand, kept his wits about him and waited for a more proper moment. The race of coon and coon dogs continued past the big oak tree and rounded clockwise around the tree. Wes quickly took up the position by the tree and poised himself with the stick already raised high in the air to prevent a repeat of Wayne's error. Thus, cocked Wes just waited for his moment. He heard the coon coming, and he tensed up all his 11-year-old muscles into one big knot, and just at the moment he saw the coon come into view around the tree, he brought the stick down as hard as he could. He had not committed Wayne's error. He invented one of his own. The coon passed under the stick untouched. Miss Nell was not so lucky. The dog had almost caught the coon, but she had the misfortune instead to catch the heavy end of Wes's stick. We went home empty-handed, and the use of sticks and clubs was forever banned in future events. After finally regaining consciousness, the look in Miss Nell's eyes made it plain to Wes that she would never go hunting with him again. To this day, Wes would much rather go fishing than hunting.